Have you noticed that something feels different lately, even if nothing obvious has changed on the surface? The goals that used to pull you forward don't seem to carry the same weight. Certain conversations leave you strangely exhausted. Places that once felt familiar now feel distant, as if you're looking at your own life from somewhere just beyond it. You can't quite explain it, but a quiet part of you already knows that something is ending. What's strange is that this doesn't always arrive as a dramatic crisis. Sometimes it appears as a subtle feeling you can't shake. A growing sense that the person you've spent years becoming no longer fits the life unfolding in front of you. And if that's true, then an unsettling question begins to emerge. If you are no longer who you were, who exactly is disappearing? And why does reality seem to be placing signs, patterns, and experiences in your path, as if it's trying to prepare you for something you cannot yet see? There is a moment that catches most people by surprise. It doesn't happen when they fail. It often happens when they succeed. They finally reach something they once wanted desperately, only to discover that the feeling they expected never arrives. The achievement is real. The effort was real. Yet something inside remains strangely untouched. For a while, they assume they're simply ungrateful, but something deeper may be happening. What makes this experience so confusing is that the goal itself was never meaningless. At one point, it carried genuine importance. It gave direction during uncertain years. It provided structure when life felt chaotic. It helped create movement when standing still felt unbearable. The problem is not that the dream was false. The problem is that the version of you who needed that dream may no longer exist. Most people assume that desires come entirely from personal choice, but many ambitions are born from invisible circumstances. Some emerge from loneliness, others from insecurity. Some are attempts to prove something to others. Some are attempts to prove something to ourselves. The strange thing is that once the underlying wound begins to heal, the goal attached to it often loses its emotional charge. This is why certain achievements suddenly feel hollow. Not because you fail to appreciate them, but because they belong to a different chapter of your life. You are trying to receive nourishment from something that was designed to feed an older version of yourself. And somewhere inside, you can feel the mismatch growing stronger. You may have noticed this in small ways. A career path that once excited you now feels strangely mechanical. A dream you've carried for years suddenly seems distant. Even the rewards you've imagined countless times no longer produce the same emotional reaction. It feels confusing because your mind still remembers wanting these things, while something deeper has already moved on. The hidden truth is that meaning doesn't disappear. It relocates. When old goals lose their power, it often means your attention is being pulled towards something your conscious mind hasn't fully recognized yet. This creates a strange period where motivation decreases before clarity arrives. Most people interpret this as failure. In reality, it may be a transition. This is why life can feel so uncertain during periods of transformation. The old map no longer works, but the new map hasn't appeared. You wake up feeling disconnected from ambitions that once defined your identity. And because those ambitions were tied to your sense of self, their disappearance feels personal. It feels as though part of you is fading away. But if old goals are losing their hold, perhaps they were never the deepest part of your identity to begin with. Perhaps they were only protective structures built around something else. And if that's true, an even more unsettling question begins to emerge. What exactly was the person you became trying to protect all these years? Most people believe they know who they are. But what they often know is who they had to become in order to survive. The difference between those two things is far greater than it first appears. Because long before we consciously shape our identity, life quietly shapes it for us. A child who feels unseen may learn to become exceptional. Someone who experiences rejection may become endlessly agreeable. A person who grows up around unpredictability may become obsessed with control. At first, these adaptations are brilliant. They help us navigate difficult environments. They help us avoid pain. They help us endure. The strange thing is that survival strategies rarely disappear when the danger passes. They continue operating long after their original purpose is gone. They become habits, then personality traits, then identity. Eventually, we stop seeing them as adaptations and start seeing them as who we are. This is why transformation often feels confusing. What appears to be personal growth is sometimes the gradual collapse of old defense mechanisms. The perfectionist begins questioning why every mistake feels catastrophic. The people pleaser starts noticing how exhausted they are. The endlessly independent person begins wondering why asking for help feels almost impossible. At first, these realizations can be uncomfortable, because survival identities usually come with rewards. They earn approval. They create safety. They produce predictable outcomes. Letting go of them feels risky, even when they are no longer serving us. Part of the mind would rather remain familiar than become free. You may have experienced this yourself. Perhaps you've started saying no to things you once tolerated. Perhaps certain social roles feel increasingly artificial. Maybe you're noticing how much energy it takes to maintain a version of yourself that no longer feels authentic. The effort becomes harder to ignore. What makes this process so unsettling is that the mind interprets it as loss. It feels as though something valuable is being taken away. Yet what is disappearing is often not your true self. It is the protective shell that once helped you survive. The difficulty comes from the fact that the shell has been worn for so long that it feels inseparable from who you are. And this leads to a realization many people are completely unprepared for. If the identity that protected you is beginning to dissolve, the emotions that follow may not feel like excitement or relief at all. They may feel surprisingly similar to grief. And that is where the next layer of this transformation begins to reveal itself. Most people expect transformation to feel inspiring. They imagine clarity, freedom, excitement, and relief. What they don't expect is sadness. Yet one of the most overlooked aspects of personal change is that growth often carries the emotional weight of loss. Even when life is moving in the right direction, something is still being left behind. The strange thing about grief is that it isn't limited to people, places, or events. We can grieve versions of ourselves. We can grieve old dreams. We can grieve identities that once gave us certainty. And because these losses are invisible, they often go unrecognized. The emotion is felt, but its source remains hidden. You may have experienced moments where old photographs suddenly affect you in unexpected ways. Not because you want to return to the past, but because you realize that person no longer exists. Their fears were different. Their hopes were different. Their hopes were different. Their understanding of life was different. Looking back becomes a strange encounter with someone who feels both familiar and foreign. This is why periods of transformation often feel emotionally contradictory. One part of you senses that you're moving towards something important. Another part feels sorrow for what is disappearing. Both experiences can exist at the same time. The mind struggles with this paradox because it wants change to feel entirely positive or entirely negative. Reality is rarely that simple. There are days when the grief appears unexpectedly. A song you've heard 100 times suddenly hits differently. A memory surfaces without warning. A conversation reminds you of a life chapter that quietly ended without any formal goodbye. You realize that entire worlds have vanished from your experience, and most of them disappeared without you noticing. The hidden truth is that grief is often evidence of expansion. You don't mourn what never mattered. The sadness exists because the old version of you carried genuine experiences, genuine struggles, and genuine meaning. Transformation doesn't erase those chapters. It simply prevents you from living inside them forever. What makes this stage difficult is that many people interpret grief as a sign they should turn back. They assume that if letting go hurts, then letting go must be wrong. But sometimes pain is not a warning. Sometimes it is simply the emotional cost of crossing a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And that is where the deeper challenge begins. Because once you realize the old version of yourself is fading, a new question emerges from the silence. If you cannot return to who you were, Are you truly ready to discover who you might become? Most people think they are afraid of failure. But often, what frightens them even more is the possibility of becoming someone unfamiliar. Failure allows identity to remain intact. Transformation does not, and the mind has a complicated relationship with anything that threatens what feels known. This is why positive change can trigger unexpected resistance. You finally get the opportunity you've been waiting for, and suddenly doubt appears. You meet someone who treats you differently, and part of you wants to retreat. Life begins opening doors, yet something inside hesitates. It feels irrational until you understand what is happening beneath the surface. The mind values familiarity more than happiness. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. This is why people sometimes remain attached to situations they have already outgrown. Not because they enjoy them, but because they understand them. The known world, even when uncomfortable, creates the illusion of control. You may have noticed this pattern during major life transitions. Just as things begin improving, old fears return. Old habits resurface. Old thoughts become louder. It can feel as though you're sabotaging yourself. In reality, part of your psychology is trying to preserve continuity. It is attempting to protect the identity it has spent years maintaining. The paradox is that the closer you get to meaningful change, the stronger this resistance can become. Not because you're moving in the wrong direction, but because you're approaching territory your current identity has never explored. Every transformation contains a moment where certainty disappears before confidence arrives. This explains why so many people experience periods of confusion before breakthroughs. The confusion is not a malfunction. It is evidence that old assumptions are being dismantled. Reality begins looking different because the lens through which you viewed reality is changing. The world itself hasn't transformed overnight. Your relationship to it has. There is also something else happening during this stage that many people fail to recognize. As your inner landscape shifts, certain relationships, environments, and social roles begin feeling strangely out of alignment. Conversations that once energized you may now feel draining. Connections that once felt natural may start feeling forced. And that observation leads directly into one of the most unexpected aspects of transformation. Because the moment your inner world begins changing, the people around you often start reflecting that change back to you in ways you never anticipated. One of the quietest signs that you're changing is not found within you at all. It appears in your relationships. Not because people suddenly become different overnight, but because you begin seeing dynamics that were invisible before. Conversations start feeling unfamiliar. Certain interactions leave you strangely depleted. You walk away wondering why something that once felt effortless now feels heavy. At first, most people assume the problem is temporary. Stress, a busy schedule, a passing mood. But then the pattern repeats. You notice yourself staying silent during discussions that once interested you. You find yourself craving depth where you once accepted distraction. The emotional nourishment you used to receive from certain connections begins to fade. What makes this difficult is that growth does not automatically erase affection. You can still care deeply about people who no longer fit who you're becoming. In fact, that is often what makes the experience painful. There is no conflict, no dramatic betrayal, just a growing awareness that two paths are quietly moving in different directions. Many people experience this with friendships that lasted for years. Everything appears unchanged on the surface, yet something feels different underneath. The conversations circle around the same topics, the same complaints, the same identities. Meanwhile, you find yourself pulled toward questions that didn't matter to you before. Questions about meaning, direction, authenticity. What is actually worth your attention? The hidden truth is that relationships are often built around shared versions of reality. When your perception changes, the relationship sometimes struggles to maintain its old shape. Not because anyone is wrong, but because the invisible agreement that once connected you is being rewritten. You may even notice this within your family, your workplace, or your closest partnerships. Certain roles you've always played begin feeling unnatural. The peacemaker, the rescuer, the one who always says yes. the one who always says yes, the one who never asks for anything. As these roles loosen their grip, people around you may respond with confusion. After all, they became accustomed to a version of you that is quietly disappearing. This can create a strange sense of loneliness. Not because you're alone, but because fewer people seem able to meet you where you are. The world begins feeling different, yet you cannot fully explain why. You are standing between two realities, one that feels too small and another that has not fully revealed itself. And perhaps that is why this stage feels so unsettling. Because when old relationships, identities, and certainties begin loosening their hold, there is often a period where nothing feels solid anymore. A strange silence emerges. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that exists between what was and what is about to become. There is a phase of transformation that almost nobody talks about. It arrives after the old identity begins fading, but before the new one fully appears. It is not dramatic. It is not inspiring. Most of the time, it feels like standing in an empty room waiting for something you cannot name. During this period, many people become convinced that something is wrong. Progress seems to stall. Motivation disappears. The future feels blurry. Life continues moving, yet an invisible sense of suspension hangs over everything. You are no longer who you were, but you cannot yet recognize who you are becoming. This is one of the most misunderstood experiences in human development, because the mind expects transformation to happen like a movie scene. One clear ending followed by one clear beginning. Real life rarely works that way. More often, identities dissolve gradually, creating a temporary void where certainty used to live. You may notice this in unexpected ways. Activities that once defined you no longer generate excitement. New interests appear, then disappear. Decisions that used to feel obvious suddenly require reflection. Even your emotional reactions begin changing. Situations that once triggered you now feel strangely neutral. It is as if the operating system of your inner world is being rewritten in the background. The paradox is that this silence often feels empty when it is actually full. Beneath the surface, countless unseen adjustments are taking place. Old beliefs are losing authority. New values are forming. Hidden priorities are rearranging themselves. The visible results have not arrived yet, but the architecture is already changing. Nature follows this pattern everywhere. The caterpillar dissolves before becoming something new. Seasons pause between extremes. Dawn arrives through gradual light, not instant brightness. Yet when this process happens within us, we often panic. We mistake the absence of clarity for the absence of progress. The hidden truth is that uncertainty is not always a sign that you've lost your way. Sometimes uncertainty is what happens when the old map no longer works and the new landscape has not fully emerged. The discomfort comes from trying to force an answer before the deeper reorganization is complete. And if that reorganization is already happening beneath the surface, then perhaps the changes you've been noticing are not random at all. Perhaps there are subtle signs already appearing in your daily life, clues that your priorities, desires, and values are quietly rearranging themselves without your conscious permission. One of the strangest things about transformation is that it often becomes visible long before it becomes understandable. The evidence appears in small moments. A conversation that once fascinated you suddenly feels exhausting. A quiet evening alone feels more valuable than chasing stimulation. Things that once seemed urgent begin losing their emotional grip. At first, these changes can seem random. You tell yourself you're simply going through a phase. But then the pattern continues. The books you're drawn to change. The questions occupying your mind change. Even the way you spend your attention begins shifting. And attention is rarely random. It tends to move toward whatever is becoming important beneath conscious awareness. You may notice yourself caring less about being impressive and more about being genuine, less about winning approval and more about feeling aligned. The strange part is that these changes often occur without a deliberate decision. No dramatic declaration is made. No clear turning point appears, yet something inside quietly adjusts the direction of your life. The hidden truth is that priorities are not always chosen. Sometimes they emerge. They reorganize themselves as your perception changes. What once felt meaningful was connected to a certain understanding of reality. As that understanding evolves, the emotional value of things evolves with it. The external world remains largely the same, but your relationship to it transforms. This is why some people become fascinated by subjects they never cared about before. Why others lose interest in goals they spent years pursuing. Why familiar environments can suddenly feel foreign. The shift is not necessarily happening around you. It is happening within the lens through which you experience everything. There is also a subtler sign that many people overlook. Your tolerance begins changing. Not just your preferences, but your tolerance. You become less willing to ignore what drains you. Less willing to remain in situations that require you to abandon yourself. Things you once accepted without question begin feeling impossible to justify. This often creates tension because the old identity tries to maintain continuity. It whispers that you're overreacting, that you're becoming too sensitive, that you should return to who you were. Yet another part of you senses something important. A growing awareness that certain compromises are no longer compatible with the person emerging beneath the surface. And eventually, this internal tension reaches a critical point, because there comes a moment when the effort required to resist change becomes greater than the effort required to surrender to it. And that is where everything begins to accelerate. For a long time, most people assume their discomfort is coming from the transformation itself. They believe the uncertainty, confusion, and emotional turbulence are signs that something has gone wrong. But eventually a surprising realization begins to emerge. Much of the suffering was never created by the change. It was created by resistance to the change. Resistance is subtle. It often disguises itself as caution, logic, or responsibility. It appears as endless analysis, endless second-guessing, endless attempts to restore a version of life that no longer fits. The mind keeps reaching backward, trying to recover a certainty that has already dissolved. What makes this so exhausting is that reality keeps moving forward anyway. Life continues presenting new experiences, new perspectives, new opportunities to evolve. Yet part of the self remains occupied with preserving an identity that is quietly disappearing. This creates an invisible tug-of-war that drains enormous amounts of emotional energy. You may have felt this yourself. The moment you stopped forcing an answer, clarity began appearing. The moment you stopped chasing certainty, unexpected opportunities emerged. The moment you stopped trying to control every outcome, life became strangely easier to navigate. Not because everything was solved, but because you were no longer fighting every current. The hidden paradox is that acceptance does not mean passivity. It does not mean giving up. It means recognizing what is already happening. A river flows more naturally when it stops trying to move backward. In much the same way, transformation accelerates when we stop demanding that it unfold according to our preferred timeline. This is why people often describe major life changes as if they happened all at once. In reality, the change was unfolding for years. What happened suddenly was their willingness to stop resisting it. The breakthrough was not the beginning of the process. It was the moment they finally aligned themselves with a process already underway. And yet there is one final mystery hidden inside all of this. If the old version of you has been dissolving for longer than you realized, and if the new version has already been quietly emerging beneath the surface, then perhaps the question was never whether transformation was happening. Perhaps the real question is why you are shown these signs now, at this particular moment in your life. Because sometimes a message arrives not to create change, but to help you recognize a change that has already begun. There comes a point in life when looking backward stops being an option, even if part of you still wants the comfort of familiar ground. Not because the past was wrong, not because the person you used to be was flawed, but because every version of yourself was built for a particular chapter, and some chapters were never meant to last forever. If you've recognized yourself in these experiences, the fading goals, the shifting relationships, the strange uncertainty, the quiet feeling that something important is changing, then perhaps what you've been experiencing is not confusion at all. Perhaps it is the natural consequence of growth. The old identity is not being destroyed. It is making space for something that could not emerge while the old structure remained intact. The truth is that transformation rarely announces itself. It arrives through subtle signals, through restlessness, through dissatisfaction, through moments that seem insignificant, until you connect them years later and realize they were all pointing in the same direction. The strange coincidences, the recurring patterns, the feeling that life is quietly trying to show you something. Maybe those experiences were never interruptions. Maybe they were invitations. And perhaps the most important realization is this: you do not need to have all the answers right now. You do not need to know exactly who you are becoming. The caterpillar does not understand the butterfly while it is dissolving. The dawn does not need to see the full day to continue becoming light. Some transformations can only be understood after they have already happened. So if life feels uncertain, if parts of your old world no longer fit, if you sometimes feel caught between who you were and who you are becoming, take a breath and remember this: you may be far less lost than you think. What feels like an ending may actually be a reorganization. What feels like an ending may actually be a reorganization. What feels like emptiness may actually be preparation. And what feels like disappearance may be the beginning of a deeper arrival. If this message found you at the right moment, let it be a reminder that you are not alone in this experience. There are countless people quietly moving through the same invisible transition, wondering if anyone else understands what they're feeling. If this video resonated with you, subscribe and join us for more explorations into the hidden patterns shaping human experience. And if you found meaning here, leave a like so this message can reach someone else who may need it today. Finally, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, write just one word: becoming. Because sometimes a single word is enough to acknowledge that the person you were is fading, and something new is already beginning to emerge.